1-888-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
As we kick off a new month, the month of November, and a new week of Call to Communion right here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, but you didn't know who to ask, well, you can certainly ask us. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can always send us an email, ctc@ewtn.com. You can do that 24/7. ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very good. How was your weekend, sir?
It was pretty decent, thank you.
It was a good one for me, too. Went to a birthday party and had some Low Country Boil. Do you know about Low Country Boil?
I don't know about Low Country Boil.
Oh, man. You should look this up. Low Country Boil.
That's going down the list.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to lead off here with an email. This is from Rich, Cape Cod, Mass. Rich says, what can you tell me about the Jimmy Swaggart Church, and why do they seem to hate everything about the Catholic Church? Thank you, Rich.
I'm not a super expert on Jimmy Swaggart,
okay,
but he comes from a fundamentalist tradition that has antipathy towards Catholicism as one of the founding principles, to be honest with you.
Okay.
And I live in the Bible Belt. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I didn't go to a Jimmy Swaggart-type church growing up, but I'm certainly familiar with the culture sort of pervades the air down here, and there's a lot of it going around.
Yeah.
And, from the days of the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, the conviction that the Pope was the Antichrist and the Catholic Church the whore of Babylon was a doctrinal affirmation that the major Reformation communities made. I mean, it's actually built into some of their confessions of faith. Westminster Confession, which is the founding document of Presbyterianism, actually contains the assertion that the Pope is the Antichrist.
Wow.
And so, the self-understanding that a lot of Protestants have, I had growing up, was that we were protesting something. That's what Protestant means, and in particular, protesting what we understood to be the errors of Romanism or Catholicism. And fundamentalism, as a Protestant religious movement, it's really late 19th, early 20th century invention, came online basically in opposition to the modern world, some higher criticism, Darwinism, these kinds of things. But it had as its sort of fundamental ethos an attitude of rejection and aggression and drawing boundaries and delineating, the true believers from the false as they understood it. And so making those distinctions, those oppositions, those points of conflict very prominent in the self-understanding of people in the community was very important to them. And so none of those distinctions was more important than the distinction between, as they understood it, the true church and the so-called Church of the Antichrist, the way they understood the Roman Church.
All right.
And since that's baked into their self-understanding, I mean, you really can't have fundamentalism without it.
So there it is.
Yeah.
Well, okay, and thank you so much for your email there, Rich. Here's an interesting one that we received from Rob in Beaverton, Oregon. Dr. Anders, I seem to remember you saying that a person's conscience has primacy. Doesn't everyone who persists in gravely evil behavior find some way to convince himself that what he is doing is permissible? When we go into judgment at the end of our lives, will an appeal to conscience excuse a person from eternal loss if he spent his life in terrible sin? I have learned so much from your program. Thank you and God bless. And that's Rob in Beaverton, Oregon.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So, first of all, I'm not persuaded that every person that is involved in grave evil always justifies it as the morally correct thing to do. like particularly in that aspect. I think it might be the case that people justify their acts by pleading, I've got an extenuating circumstance, or life is difficult, or, this is very tempting, or they simply prescind from the question of justification altogether. But I don't think it's the case that most people engaging in grave evil say, this is what my conscience persuades me is the morally right thing to do in this circumstance. I imagine that's actually fairly rare. Now, if a person were genuinely persuaded on the basis of sincere deliberation and the desire to do the right thing, that they ought to do something that's objectively wrong. And the standard illustration that I like to give is, imagine in another time and a place, in a society that did not have a formal legal system, someone grew up in a culture where they only knew of the vendetta form of civil justice. And so, somebody in their family is killed by a neighboring tribe, and they feel like they have a vendetta. They have to go avenge the death and go kill somebody in the other tribe. That's obviously a grave evil. That vengeance belongs to God. That's not the way we ought to settle our differences.
Right.
But it's credible to me that somebody could grow up in a culture like that and be genuinely, sincerely ignorant that there is any other way of settling differences.
It could be all that they know.
It could be all that they know, and they may feel honor-bound to do that. And I think that, a murder conducted in those circumstances would be objectively less grave than, say, a well-formed Catholic conscience who understood perfectly well that vengeance belongs to God and you ought not to kill somebody. They're both gravely gravely evil things, but I think one conscience would be maybe more inoculated against accusation than the other. But the Catholic position is that sort of the basic elements of the natural law are more or less written into our souls, and you find that pretty consistently across cultures, not just Catholic culture, but all over the world. Principles like the golden rule: don't do unto other people what you don't want done unto you. You don't have to have a PhD in moral theology to grasp these principles, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's kind of rare, right, that people really act in total ignorance. But if they are completely and utterly, invincibly ignorant, not capable of knowing otherwise, then that does mitigate the extent of their guilt.
All right, very good. And thank you so much, Rob in Beaverton, Oregon, listening on Modern Day Radio. Glad to hear from you. In a moment, we'll get to the phones at 833-288-EWTN on Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN.
It's really awe-inspiring to know that Take Two with Jerry and Debbie has the impact that it does. We know from what our listeners share on the air, but also from corresponding with them outside of the show via email and social media. There's no better feeling than knowing you've helped someone, maybe many people at a time, work through various situations and to more clearly see God's purpose and plan for their lives.
Take Two with Jerry and Debbie, tomorrow, noon Eastern, on EWTN Radio.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
At the center of the Supreme Court Dobbs late-term abortion case is an abortion facility. It's called the Jackson Women's Health Organization, the only abortion center in Mississippi, and they're suing to keep doing late-term abortions on unborn babies who are older than 15 weeks. It has a long history of squalid and unsafe conditions. If it were any other medical facility, it would have been closed due to health risks for unsuspecting women who go in. These have included stains that may be blood, a leaking roof, unsecured controlled substances, and dust on medical equipment. Several of the conditions are not fit to share on family radio. This is the legal abortion industry, and good people in Mississippi are trying to protect mothers and their babies. Please pray for this case.
Follow us on Twitter at Life Issues USA and stay informed, more informed than you've ever been.
It's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN on this Monday afternoon. Our phone number here, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We're going to get to the phones in just a moment. First, I want to tell you about EWTN's missionary. Actually, they're called media missionaries, and this is a wonderful group of individuals. These great folks prayerfully take EWTN to parishes and the community through the print and electronic media that we provide. Now, you can help EWTN share the good news by becoming a media missionary yourself. Just go to EWTNmissionaries.com today. EWTNmissionaries.com. Join us in sharing the eternal word with the world. I've met a lot of these media missionaries. They are great folks, and they love what they do to bring the good news of what we're trying to do throughout the parish level, sometimes the diocesan level. So do check it out by going to EWTNmissionaries.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with David. David is in Walla Walla, Washington, listening on the great KHSS radio. Hey there, David. What's on your mind today?
Thank you for both of you for your show and taking my call. Dr. Anders, I'm having discussions with a good friend of mine, a Seventh-day Adventist, explaining the Catholic Church. But I'm having difficulty with a couple questions that have been posed to me. The first is, I was asked, well, why did the Catholic Church have non-Catholics killed during the Middle Ages? And I just have no answer for that or knowledge of how to answer that. And the second one is why we changed the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. And I've tried to explain Sunday now the Lord's Day, kind of like the eighth day, but I'm just having difficulty with those two questions. Again, the main one is about the Catholic Church killing non-Catholics in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question. So, first of all, people were killed in the Middle Ages for the reasons that people are always killed in every age, and for the same reasons that governments and societies and institutions have people killed today, because it typically serves their political interest or their ideological vision of the way reality ought to work. And you don't have to be a Catholic to be guilty of this crime against humanity. You can fall into almost any sort of religious or ideological group, and you'll find somebody that floats to the top of political power and falls prey to the temptation to use the sword to advance their vision of reality. That's a common feature of human existence, long before the rise of anything like biblical religion. And it continues to this day.
Sure.
And in secular as well as religious contexts. So it's disgusting and horrible, and we don't value it at all. But it's a fact of the way culture functions. Now, I like to say in the Middle Ages, when the vast majority of people were Catholic in European civilization, by definition, all the criminals were Catholic.
True.
Right? I mean, like, you're never going to have a society without criminals.
Yeah.
That's just the way the world works.
Yeah.
Well, if they're all baptized Catholics, when they're children, all the grown-up criminals are, by definition, Catholic.
Ouch.
All of the self-aggrandizing political, military ladder climbers also that have imperialistic aims were also, by definition, Catholic.
Yeah.
Is the Catholic faith per se called into opprobrium because there have been bad Catholics in history? I don't think so. I think the Catholic Church is really the major institution in world history that has articulated a critique of that way of being in the world. And the reason that we can stand back today and speak about these things and say, well, you ought not to do that. You ought not to use the sword to enforce your vision of social relations on other people violently, is because we have a conception of human dignity, right? We have a conception of human dignity, and we understand there's kind of inviolable value to the individual life. Well, where do you think that idea came from, right? You're not going to have found it in Canaanite society. I just can't see the king of Assyria, kind of wringing his hands over the plight of the poor that, and after he went and laid lace to the northern kingdom of Israel and killed all the women and children, There's an epistolary exchange in the historical record. May be spurious, but it makes my point nonetheless, between one of the great Khans of the Mongol Empire, the descendant of Genghis Khan, and a sitting pope. I forget which one, but I've read the exchange. And the Pope writes to the Khan, and he says, you're laying waste to all these Christian villages in Eastern Europe, and you're raping and pillaging and stealing and enslaving and massacring people. What did these folks ever do to you? more or less. I'm paraphrasing. And surprisingly, the great Con writes back to the Pope, and he says, more or less, I don't understand the question because they have stuff I want.
It's cutting the chase there.
Like the conception that I might have a moral obligation to respect the dignity of other individuals has an historical origin. It emerges someplace in world history, and the place that it emerges is Christendom. Now, the fact that Catholics themselves have not lived up to that dignity of the human person is a feature of their fallenness and their sinfulness. But it's not a critique of the religion that, in fact, issues the critique. A similar example, when transatlantic slavery began after the discovery of the New World, the popes issued any number of declarations saying, no transatlantic slavery. And, Catholics said, thank you very much, Pope, for your opinion, and they went about doing what they were doing. Today, the Pope says, no abortions, don't kill babies. There are plenty of Catholics, many of them in positions of power, that say, thank you very much, Mr. Pope, you're entitled to your opinion, we're going to go kill babies if we want to, because it suits our political or economic or ideological agenda. That's just the way the world is. Now, with respect to the business about the Sabbath, the Seventh-day Adventists have a false conception about the nature of these liturgical feasts and sacred Scripture. The idea that that Saturday was set aside uniquely as a day of worship for ancient Israel is false. I would challenge you to go read the Sabbath commandment. It doesn't say anything about setting the Sabbath day aside as a particular day of worship or commemoration. It's a day of rest. But every day in ancient Israel was a day of worship. Temple sacrifices were going on all the time. And so there is not a perfect one-to-one correlation between the Christian feast of Sunday and the Jewish Sabbath. We would say that the feast of Sunday is a sort of fulfillment of the expectation of a Sabbath rest, but it is not we just bumped the Sabbath forward one day in the calendar. Far from it. It is a commemoration of the day of the Lord's resurrection. And in Christian antiquity, it was not particularly set aside as a day of rest. And of course, when you lived in the Roman social order, there was no precedent for taking a weekend, taking a day off on the week. And so Christians would gather at dawn on the first day of the week and celebrate Holy Mass and commemorate the Lord's resurrection, and then get about going to their jobs. And many of them were slaves. They didn't call in sick. It was the commemoration of the Lord's resurrection.
Sure.
And of course, it's witnessed in sacred Scripture. We read about how the early church would gather on the first day of the week to hear the apostles preaching and to break bread. Now, the Sabbath, as imposed by Mosaic law on Israel's civil society, is not binding in precisely the same way on Gentile Christians who have become believers in Jesus. We're not Jews. We don't follow the Mosaic Code. The new law of loving God and loving neighbor is now written on our hearts, but the particulars of Mosaic legislation are not binding on the church.
David, is that helpful for you?
Yes, that's very, very helpful, and thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.
Well, you are welcome. Glad that you're listening to us on KHSS, one of our longtime partners there in Walla Walla. And that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you call now, we can get your question on the air today, I promise, here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Here's a question from Berta, who asked this question via YouTube. Dear Dr. Anders, how can I explain what a dogma is?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Appreciate the question. A dogma is a Christian doctrine that the church has formally declared to have been divinely revealed. And therefore, it is mandatory that all Christians hold that assertion, that doctrine, with divine and supernatural faith. So not every Christian doctrine is propounded in precisely that way, but sometimes there's a matter of Christian belief that gets called into question, and it's central to the church's identity and self-understanding and profession of faith, and in order to remove all doubt and afford a certainty in the act of faith, the magisterium will issue a formal declaration that, yes, this particular Christian truth, God revealed this to be the case, and it is essential to the act of faith, and then becomes a moral obligation to actually affirm that particular doctrine. The prime example would be the dogma of the Blessed Trinity. Also, the incarnation of our Lord in two natures, one person. The transubstantiation of Christ's body and blood in the institution of the Holy Mass. These kinds of things. Now, not everything gets proclaimed as a dogma. I think my favorite example of not proclaiming something dogmatically was in the late 16th century. The Jesuits and the Dominicans got in a big fight over whether or not God granted efficacious grace on the basis of his knowledge of counterfactuals.
Whoa.
And they really went to hammer and tongs over this thing, and for many years, actually. And the Pope kind of got fed up with them, and he said, go home and teach theology, and I'll let you know when I've made up my mind. And it's been 500 years, and we're still waiting for a dogma on the nature of efficacious grace, meaning the Church decided not to decide.
Sure.
And both of the positions of each of those schools of theology is permissible, even though they're actually they're incommensurate with one another.
All right, Berta, thank you so much for your question. And our phone number again, 833-288-EWTN, if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or if you'd like to tell us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. 833-288-3986. Cora's watching us on Facebook this afternoon. Cora says, I attended the Methodist Sunday service in honor of my late mother-in-law, and during that service, they recited the Creed. And the Creed I heard at this Methodist church was exactly the same one that we say at the Mass on Sunday. So my question to you is, why are the words, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church, Communion of Saints, Blessed Virgin Mary, why are they in the Methodist Church?
Yes, thank you. Because Methodism is kind of parasitic on Anglicanism. It's an outgrowth of the Anglican Church, the Reformation in England, Henry VIII. And the Anglican Church was very self-consciously articulated an apology for itself, an argument that they were in fact in continuity with the ancient Christian Church. And I think that claim is spurious. I don't think it's valid, but many of the major Protestant reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Cranmer, Swiss, German, and English reformers, they did not want to be accused credibly of novelty. They didn't want to act like they were leaving the Catholic Church to go start something new, because they understood that'd be problematic, given that Jesus had said the gates of hell would never prevail against the Church. They had a high doctrine of the Church, and they had a high regard for the idea of historical continuity. So the argument that they made, and I don't think it's valid, but the argument they made was that the distinctions of Roman Catholicism were accretions, like barnacles, that had clung onto the ship of the Church, and that they were retaining all of the truly quote-unquote Catholic elements and just kind of peeling off the barnacles. Little tiny things like the papacy they were getting rid of. But they were kind of keeping that's sort of the way the argument went. And so they had a strong conception of themselves of being the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Now, the claim strains credibility at a number of levels, not the least of which is that the people that engaged in this program couldn't agree with one another on what that one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church was. So they all claimed to be it. They all claimed to be the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, but they couldn't agree with one another. And in principle, in particular, they couldn't agree on the nature of the Eucharist. So between the Lutherans and the Zwinglians, for example, this was a deal breaker, an absolute deal breaker. They could not get together on that. And Calvin came by a few, generation later and said, I'm going to solve the problem. So he split the difference between the Zwinglians and the Lutherans, hoping that would solve the problem. It just created a third stream, a new theological tradition.
Great.
Anglicanism has its own way of handling these things. And, of course, it had its own internal conflicts between sort of the high church, more ecclesial sacramental people and then the Puritan tradition. And so it wasn't until you got to really the 18th century and so-called First Great Awakening in the colonies, George Whitefield is where I date it, where you find the idea that, hey, it doesn't really matter, these differences of ecclesiology and sacraments, we can disagree on that stuff. And by the 19th century, you get the idea that the church is just an entirely invisible institution, a collection of those who have quote unquote real faith for Jesus in their heart, but no formal, institutional identity that's uniform. But that's a very, very modern innovation in Protestant history. From the earliest days, they've really much wanted to retain that sense of Catholicity and continuity with antiquity.
Hence terms like I believe in the Holy Catholic Church and Communion of Saints and Blessed Virgin Mary. That's why those are still in there.
Yeah, those are from the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed from 381, and they're constitutive of Catholic identity.
Well, there you go. Cora, thank you so much for checking us out today on Facebook. If you want to ask a question via Facebook, because we're streaming on Facebook and YouTube right now, all you have to do is put that question of yours in the comments box, and then that'll come to us here in the studio. In a moment, we'll get back to the phones for your calls at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call now. We'll try to get your call on this afternoon here on Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on EWTN.
Smart speakers help with a lot these days. Did you know you can use your smart speaker to hear the top stories of the day from a Catholic perspective?
On Google Home, all you have to do is walk up to your speaker and say, "Hey Google, play Catholic News."
Here's the latest news.
Welcome to your daily Catholic news briefing.
For more information on how to get the latest Catholic news on your smart speaker or wherever you get your podcasts, go to CatholicNewsAgency.com/smart speakers.
Want to be notified when Called to Communion goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
60 Seconds with Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen.
Our Lord worked many miracles. Here are some of the characteristics about them. First, he worked them as signs to convince men of the fact that he who came to work these miracles was the one that was promised. He never worked a miracle to amaze a multitude. He never worked a miracle to satisfy his hunger or his thirst. He never worked a miracle to obtain a living. He never received money for the things which he accomplished. He refused to convert the stones of the wilderness into bread to satisfy his own hunger, or to cause water to gush out of a rock to slake his thirst. Instead, he asked a woman to let down her bucket to give him a drink.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
EWTN Radio brings you the Holy Rosary twice each day for over 25 years. Tune in every morning for Mother Angelica and every evening for Father Benedict Groeschel, only on EWTN Radio.
Hey, what's keeping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you call now, we'll probably get your call on today's program. All right, let us go now to Tom. Tom is in Knoxville, Tennessee. And let me click the magic clicker. There we go. Tom, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Hi, Dr. Anders. How are you, sir?
I'm all right. Thanks. How about you?
I'm doing well. My question was about Constantine, and obviously during this week you always hear about All Saints, and you always hear the Catholic or the Catholics worship saints and all that. But one of the comments was that Constantine founded Catholicism, and I was like, I know that's not true, but I was curious about the church existing before him. I think Ignatius of Antioch was around before him, but did he have anything? Did Constantine have anything to do with altering the church or adding to it or anything?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks be to God, yes. Most important thing Constantine did was issue the Edict of Milan in 313, which granted formal toleration to the Christian church in the empire. before then, being a Christian in the Roman Empire could get you killed or tortured to death or exiled. It was pretty nasty stuff. And in fact, Constantine's father was involved in that. The last great persecution, it continued after this, actually, but the last sort of empire-wide persecution of Christians, the Diocletian persecution around 300, was pretty nasty business. And before that, the Decian persecution in the 250s was pretty awful as well. And there were periodic, sporadic persecutions of Christians throughout the empire. So thanks be to God, Constantine legalized the thing. And I think those of us who live in the modern West and we more or less enjoy religious freedom could deeply appreciate how would it be if all of a sudden the government said, well, come sacrifice to the gods of the day or we're going to kill you. And that's the condition of the church for a couple centuries.
Yeah.
And Constantine put an end to all of that. So that naturally greatly facilitated the growth of Christianity. So I'd say that's a pretty substantial contribution to Christian identity. I don't have to die, literally the death of martyrdom, in order to go to church. Something we all take for granted today. So that's fantastic. Another thing that Constantine did of great value was, and but the controversy itself had nothing to do with him, but prior to Constantine, there was a big controversy, theological controversy, that emerged in the early 4th century Christian church over the nature of Christ's divinity. And everybody confessed that Jesus was divine, but people kind of scratched their heads over exactly what that meant. Because, of course, the doctrine of God's unicity, that there is only one God, seemed to pose difficulties, logical difficulties for the doctrine of the incarnation. Well, there was a presbyter in Alexandria, Egypt, named Arius, who thought he'd solved the problem logically by denying the full divinity of Jesus. He said, well, Jesus is God, but with a small g, not capital G-O-D, full stop. And he was very popular, especially with the intelligentsia and quite a few bishops, actually. He created a hubbub that threatened to split the Christian world into two factions. And actually it did split the Christian world into two factions. And Constantine himself had become a Christian, and he hoped that the Christian church could be a force for unity in the empire. So he was very distressed about the social impact of this theological controversy. And after a few abortive attempts to solve it, he encouraged the bishops to gather in council and to deal with it in a really formal and universal way. And so there was an impetus there for calling the Council of Nicaea, which defined the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity. Now, again, Constantine's intervention, Constantine didn't define the dogma. He wasn't particularly happy with the way it came through, and his own theological formation was pretty poor, and his attempts to engage this conversationally were rather lacking, right? And he didn't have any authority to call the council or to issue its declarations, but he encouraged the bishops to, and they did. And he facilitated it and granted them protection and so forth for that. So the Council of Nicaea gave us the dogma of the Trinity, which is very constitutive of Christian identity. Now, not on Constantine's instructions. Constantine, again, he's not the guy that authored the Confession of Faith, but he gave political cover to make it possible. Yeah. Again, that's something I think we should be grateful for, not fault the man for that. Now, in terms of the prehistory of Catholicism was founded by Jesus Christ. Christ ascended to heaven someplace around 33 A.D., more or less. So we're talking 300 years of Catholic history prior to Constantine. The church constituted as a visible society with a hierarchical form of government, determinate act of faith, and sacraments that were recognized throughout the entire world. The reason that there were bishops to get into fights with one another, right, for Constantine to talk to, was that there was an existing self-professed, understood Catholic Church, and that language is very much used, that is recognizably the same institution founded by Jesus and the one that existed post-Constantine. And so Constantine's certainly not the founder of Catholicism. That's really an absurd proposition. But he definitely is a figure of Christian history, and thanks for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Let's go now to Eric. Eric is a first-time listener in Aurora, Oregon, listening on Modern Day Radio. Eric, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hello there. Thank you again for taking me on here. So you had mentioned before if individuals were kind of not feeling like they could accept the Catholic Church. I'm not putting that the best way, but I was Lutheran, and I was looking to get closer to the roots of my faith, and I felt that was with the Catholic Church. At the same time, I realized, was looking at all of the other faiths and religions in the world and the different nations, their different origins, and I had the question, how do I know where I'm going is the right path when there are so many different paths in front of me? Mm-hmm. So essentially the question is, what advice would you give to somebody like myself who is questioning?
Yes.
And looking for that.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate this question. So first of all, I'm going to recommend a book to you. It's a little bit heady, but it's a very good book, and it's by Joseph Ratzinger, theologian who became Pope Benedict XVI. And the book is entitled Introduction to Christianity. And he wrote it back in the 1960s, but it's perennial, and it's still in print, and it's very good. And the reason I'm recommending it is that Ratzinger is a theologian who, and he continued to do this when he was Pope, by the way, who confronted with eyes wide open, in total honesty and deep sincerity, I think, the challenge of modernity. And that includes the challenge of pluralism that you just articulated, as well as historical criticism, scientific revolution, all the rest of it. And he articulates a path, a rational path to an active faith in the Christian religion that takes full cognizance of those challenges. And I think you would be surprised and pleased by some of the conclusions that he comes to. So for a lengthier treatment, I'd start availing yourself of Ratzinger's wisdom, and I'd start with his book, Introduction to Christianity. But in summary, this is how the Catholic faith has always sort of understood this question. We've never claimed that the world religions are just wholly false. Never taken that position at all. On the contrary, the biblical teaching is that the truth about God and our transcendent destiny and the moral life and even our need for salvation is written into the fabric of the human soul. This is constitutive of our humanity. And so both philosophically and aspirationally, as it's articulated either in formal treatises or in myth, we would expect to find truth and commonality across world cultures and world religions. And so I myself love to read this kind of literature. And if I turn to the ancient Greeks, for example, I pick up Socrates and Plato, and I see things that strike me as deeply true and evocative of the transcendent and the eternal order, and motivate me to the life of virtue or charity or longing for God, and see many points of commonality with the Catholic faith. That's what I should expect to find, right? I'm not surprised by that. That's what the faith tells me I should find. If I turn to ancient Indian philosophy, and I find I have a similar response to the Vedas or the Tipitaka, I should have the same sort of response. Or if I turn to the Tao Te Ching in ancient China, I'm not offended or in any way threatened by the witness to truth, to human goodness, to a desire for transcendence, to an awareness of the finitude and the limits on human knowledge. All these things are things that I would expect to find in these other religious traditions. Justin Martyr, who's a famous Catholic theologian from the 2nd century, died about 165, wrote a couple of works, the Apology, the Second Apology, his dialogue with Trypho. But the Second Apology in particular is very helpful here, because his position is that John's Gospel tells us that the Logos, the Word, that is with God and is God, through whom God made all things, is the principle of the intelligibility of the universe. The reason that the world is intelligible, makes sense, can be grasped by reason, is that there is a principle of intelligibility built into it by God himself. That principle became incarnate in Jesus Christ. The Word became incarnate in Christ. And that same principle, St. John tells us, enlightens the minds of every person. Our being made in God's likeness and image means that we have an aptitude, a receptivity, an openness to that transcendent truth. And Justin says, we find echoes and hints of this in every culture, in every place. What's the gift of the Catholic faith is that these things that other traditions have laid hold of, aspirationally or philosophically or mythologically, becomes incarnate in Jesus. Becomes incarnate in Jesus. C.S. Lewis, the Anglican theologian, put it this way. He said Christianity writes in capital letters what nature had written in a cribbed hand. You know, Christ is not the contradiction of, but the fulfillment of the religious aspirations of humankind. And so the attitude one takes is one of charity, of openness, of engagement, of dialogue, of appreciation for world history and culture, and a willingness to find points of commonality and even to be informed by other traditions. If you look at, I believe it's paragraph 254, I could be wrong, but you can try that one, of Pope Francis's first apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, on evangelism, where he talks specifically about the attitude that Christian people ought to have towards the world religions. And it's exactly the kind of language that I'm using, right? Not a fearful, oppositional, sort of hateful, conquest kind of attitude, but
Yeah.
open, positive, engaged, dialogic appreciation, with a confession, our understanding as Christians, that everything that is represented that's true and good and beautiful in world history and culture and religion, we believe becomes incarnate in Jesus as the perfect manifestation, the last revelation, and the ultimate expression of these things in our Savior.
Hence the church that Jesus founded.
Hence the church that he founded.
There you go. Eric, thank you so much for your call. It's called Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Got to hear a great show today, and that was Women of Grace. And once a month, Johnette Williams gets together with her husband, Jack Williams. They have a wonderful time talking about the sacrament of marriage, what it's like to be in a happily married, couple. It's just a great show. And they do that once a month. But the show is fantastic every day. Be sure to join us for Women of Grace tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern. Johnette shows you how to embrace the Catholic life with joy and peace. Check it out tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. Meanwhile, it's called to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Let's go to Seth now. Seth is in Quincy, Illinois, listening online, EWTN.com. Hello, Seth. What's on your mind today?
Hey, I was wondering what the difference is between the Presbyterian Church and the Catholic Church, or on what point they split apart. I was talking with my grandmother-in-law the other day, and she said the Catholic Church split off from the Presbyterian Church, and it challenged my worldview, and the conversation got awkward and kind of fizzled out. But I never got my answers. Could you help me out?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So Presbyterianism is of Scottish derivation, emerged in the 16th century, but it is part of a family of churches that came also out of the earlier 16th century called the Reformed tradition, R-E-F-O-R-M-E-D. And you're familiar with the name of Martin Luther, I think. Luther was an Augustinian monk in Germany who left the Catholic Church to begin the Lutheran tradition, and he set in motion what we call the Protestant Reformation, which was a historical movement in Northern Europe in the 16th century to critique Catholicism, which at that point was 1,500 years old, and to articulate alternatives, right? The other major player in the early 16th century, other than Luther, was a man in Zurich, Switzerland named Ulrich Zwingli. And Zwingli and Luther did not agree on a lot of things. They both agreed on rejecting Catholicism, but they disagreed on other things. And there was a theologian that came about a generation later by the name of John Calvin. He was actually a Frenchman who immigrated to Geneva in 1536, got himself kicked out in 1537, came back in 1539, and he lived there until 1564 when he died. And Calvin was a brilliant man and very gifted and talented person, and he wanted to try to heal the breach between the Swiss and the Germans. So he articulated a distinct theological vision, call that the Calvinism, but more in line with Zwingli than Luther on a lot of issues. And the tradition that he really gave shape to came to be known throughout the world as the Reformed tradition. A version of it emerged in Scotland in the 16th century, and that's what we call Presbyterianism. So Presbyterianism is a 16th century innovation. The Catholic Church was founded by Jesus in the 1st century, so it definitely did not split off from Presbyterianism. It's very much the other way around.
Okay. Appreciate your call. Thank you so much for it. Let's go to Darren now. Darren is in Clayton, New Mexico, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Hey, Darren, what's on your mind today?
Hey, good morning, guys. Morning, Dr. Anders.
Howdy.
I don't know if you remember me. I've called a few times. I just want to let you know I finally got through the Old Testament with with a bunch of little side research, and I think I've expressed this before. I'm an atheist. That being said, my wife is listening to your show now. She loves your guys' show. Your knowledge on religious history is why I keep coming back to you. But my question for you was today. I guess the big thing I'm trying to unite the Old Testament God with Jesus, who to me does sound like a good moral character. But then when I read verses in like Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, really the one I was calling about today was if you could touch on Leviticus 21:18 to me, and I'm just curious how the church separates such a heinous quote, and then that is Jesus' father, or they're one and the same. So I just don't understand how such a heinous quote could be applied. If you could address that.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the question a lot. So how does Jesus approach the Old Testament? Christ has a pretty interesting attitude towards the Old Testament. He views it as provisional and as a kind of condescension to human weakness. He does not think it has the last word in human morality. The one place actually a couple places where Jesus engages this question specifically. One has to do with the law on divorce. And if you look at Matthew chapter 19, for example, there was a provision in the Mosaic law that allowed men to divorce their wives. Now, there was a debate in first century Judaism about whether you had to have cause to divorce your wife, or if you could divorce your wife for any reason. And we actually have some records of these rabbinical debates, and the most liberal position was taken by Hillel, who, if memory serves me correct, and you Hillel scholars can correct me if I get this wrong, I think he said you don't have to have cause. And if you did, it was pretty light cause. Rabbi Akiva argued, I believe, that you could divorce your wife if she got a little bit dumpy or cooked a bad meal. You didn't have to have much reason.
Wow.
Now, if you know anything about the condition of women in antiquity, a decree of divorce would reduce a woman to penury and probably opprobrium, and it would be pretty awful, and they wouldn't have a lot of recourse. Jesus had a much more humanitarian view of the dignity of women and the inviolability of marriage. And so when asked this question, he said, no, you can't divorce your wife. And the Pharisees rightly asked, well, then why does the law of Moses permit us to do this? And he said, because of your hardness of heart. But this is not what God intends. Well, if you think about the logic of that statement, it is a astonishing kind of relativization of the Mosaic Code. Because there's not a provision in the code itself for its abrogation. No. But Christ offers an authoritative interpretation that says this is not the final word, but there's something objectively deficient about it. The same thing goes with respect to purity laws, and this comes into concerns specifically the question about the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is just eaten up with purity codes. And the division between the pure and the impure, it sort of elides the distinction between the moral and the immoral. There's not a clear-cut distinction in Leviticus between, moral and immoral on the one hand versus pure and impure on the other. And in fact, some of the Levitical sacrifices, the sin offering, for example, does not make that distinction. And so it actually contemplates the possibility of a person committing an unconscious sin. What it means by that is a purity violation, touch something unclean. Right?
Oh, okay.
Now, for a Christian, that's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as an unconscious sin. Sin is a willed, conscious, immoral act. Mm-hmm. Jesus, however, seems to completely reject the whole regime of pure and impure ritual purity and ritual impurity is having anything to do with one's relationship to God. He issues this critique to the Pharisees specifically, that they spend time dealing with issues of ritual purity, washing cups and so forth, when what they ought to attend to is the purity of their interior or moral lives. And in fact, he says it's not what goes into the body that makes it unclean, speaking here about the laws of kashrut, dietary regime, but rather what comes out of the heart, thoughts of fornication, adultery, and hatred and factions, and these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Well, again, this is rather astonishing, and it's kind of offensive to his contemporaries, but he introduces a principle of biblical interpretation. He goes in further. He says, he's asked why does Elijah come first? The prophet had said Elijah would come first. He says, well, John the Baptist was Elijah, if you're willing to accept it, indicating that something other than a purely sort of literalistic understanding of Old Testament prophecy is in order. Now, in St. Paul, who's definitely riffing on Jesus, if you will, Paul introduces the notion of allegory to the interpretation of the Old Testament in Galatians chapter 4. And he affirms, in other places too, 1 Corinthians 3, he affirms that there are allegories in the Old Testament. That's the proper way to read the text, a way that becomes possible from within the framework of the Christian faith. He says it's not possible if you don't have the framework of Jesus. If you adopt Jesus' framework, you may now read the Old Testament allegorically. In the Christian theologians of the 3rd and 4th century, this is developed into a doctrine, and you could even assert a dogma of the Catholic faith, that the proper way to read the Old Testament is spiritually and allegorically, not literally, and for all the reasons that I've already articulated. And Origen of Alexandria, the name most associated with allegorical exegesis of the Old Testament, goes so far as to say that the literal sense, when it offends, should be cast away as the bitter rind of a nut. That's a quote from Origen. Gregory of Nyssa, who is a doctor of the church, Origen is not, in his Life of Moses, says precisely the same thing about some of the more difficult passages of the Old Testament, in particular the death of the firstborn. He says we should, this taken literally, this is unconscionable. Therefore, we should read it in an allegorical and spiritual sense that accords with what we know about Christian charity. Augustine of Hippo, in On Christian Doctrine, Manual on Biblical Interpretation from the 4th century, says any interpretation of the Old Testament that offends against charity is incorrect. Now, modern interpreter that would give you a present Catholic position on this, Matthew Ramage, in his book The Dark Passages of the Old Testament, and it takes his point of reference from Pope Benedict XVI on the proper way to engage historical, critical, and allegorical interpretation of the Old Testament.
Darren, thanks so much for your call. We have just enough time to get to Elizabeth in Richmond, Virginia. Elizabeth, we got about 30 seconds here. What's on your mind?
I was on an online chat, and a fella said he rejected Catholicism because he didn't believe in the infallibility of the Pope, because that infallibility wasn't established until 1886 or something. And I didn't understand that. So my question is that a true statement?
No.
And two, if it, okay.
It's not a true statement. So the dogma was formally defined at the First Vatican Council, but like every Christian doctrine, it has a basis in divine revelation and has been believed for millennia. Right? I mean, take the point of contrast, the doctrine of the Trinity was not formally defined until 325. It doesn't mean Christians didn't believe that God was triune before then. They did believe God was triune. That's why the council defined the doctrine, to settle a matter of dispute. So when the Pope's jurisdiction and authority is called into question in modernity, the Church responds by formally defining what has always been believed, namely that the Holy Father can, in fact, issue a binding declaration of faith. He can issue a symbol of faith that requires divine and supernatural assent.
Elizabeth, thanks for your call. Couldn't get to John in Wichita Falls. John, please call us back tomorrow. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
And we'll see you tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.
This is Michael Warsaw, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of EWTN. During this month of the Rosary, EWTN, along with Relevant Radio and the Napa Institute, have come together in a joint effort to pray and promote the daily Rosary for the end to legal abortion in America and an outpouring of support for expectant mothers.